Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The United States dramatically moved to impose sanctions on Russia tonight after formally declaring Vladimir Putin's government used chemical weapons against the Skripals in Salisbury. The announcement triggers an automatic course of action against Russia, which could include banning the state airline Aeroflot from flying to the US and cut off almost all imports and exports between the two countries. Downing Street welcomed the news tonight. The president has repeatedly insisted that he is tough on Russia, despite the apparent warmth between him and President Putin. But with Russian involvement in the US elections still dogging Mr. Trump, the timing may not be coincidental.
It's great to be with you.
It is 23 days since the Helsinki summit, and despite that diplomatic effort, relations between Washington and Moscow are tonight poised to take a significant downward turn. That's because the United States has now reached the conclusion that Russia was indeed responsible for using a nerve agent in Salisbury during the attempted assassination of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. That automatically triggers a new wave of sanctions that could eventually sharply reduce trade between the two countries and even result in the banning of Aeroflot flights from landing on US soil. President Trump has already balanced his often stated desire for better relations with Moscow with a warning that Putin should not take that for granted.
Getting along with President Putin, getting along with Russia is a positive, not a negative. Right. Now, with that being said, if that doesn't work out, I'll be the worst enemy he's ever had. The worst he's ever had.
This is not the first US move since the Salisbury poisonings. Back in March, the White House expelled 60 Russian diplomats. Moscow quickly retaliated.
What we see is the Russians are looking for every opportunity.
And only a few days ago, America's top national security advisors collectively accused the Kremlin of continuing to interfere in US politics, with just 3 months to go before the midterm elections. It is a 1991 congressional law that has led to these sanctions. It mandates action if a country is known to have used chemical or biological weapons, and the act has key supporters.
We need to use that more effectively now, and we need, frankly, to be more aggressive in using other tools we have, like the 91 Act, where we could go after Russia for their use of nerve agents in the UK. Across the board, we need to be pressing right now.
Trump critics are likely to suggest that some of the motivation for this move is domestic politics. As the Mueller investigation continues to probe collusion between Trump associates and Moscow, the White House is keen to show it is tough on Russia and owes nothing to President Putin. Either way, this marks a further dramatic deterioration between the two great nuclear powers. Tonight, though, Russia has yet to respond.
So, Robert, just talk us through how these sanctions are likely to be imposed and what you anticipate that response from the Russians might be.
Well, a bit like those sanctions imposed yesterday on Iran, these measures against Russia will come in two waves. The first will be implemented in about 14 days from now. That will ban the export to Russia of key high-tech items, electronics, avionics, and so on. Then Russia will have a 90-day period in which to respond. It needs to, according to this US law, renounce any future use of nerve agents or chemical and biological weapons. It needs to allow international inspectors into its military laboratories. It seems, Julie, almost inconceivable that Russia would allow such access. So then that second tranche of sanctions would come into play, and they are much more dramatic. They would certainly ban the landing of Aeroflot flights into the United States, but they would also downgrade, even suspend diplomatic relations between the two countries and effectively end almost all trade, almost all imports and exports between the United States and Russia. Tonight, the United Kingdom government has responded, saying that it sends a clear message to Russia that any provocative and reckless behavior will not go unchallenged.
Robert, thank you very much indeed for that.
Now, this evening, not long ago, actually, the US State Department said it was imposing new sanctions on Russia in response to the use of a Novichok nerve agent in an attempt to assassinate UK citizen Sergei Skripal. Now, this was an announcement that seemed to come out of the blue and to be based on new information, or at least US information, that the Russians had broken international law by using a chemical weapon. The sanctions don't bite today. Congress gets a 15-day advance notice of them, but the UK welcomed the American action as announced. I'm joined by Professor Scott Lucas, who's from the University of Birmingham, and joins us from the city. Why now, do you think, Scott Lucas?
Well, in part, it's a bureaucratic process, because after the initial finding that Russia may have committed this attack this spring, leading to the expulsion of Russian diplomats from the U.S. as well as other countries, the Congress gave the Trump administration 60 days to report on what it found out about the attack. Now, that deadline was in July. It was missed by the administration. The State Department finally met it today and said, we have concluded that the Russian government is responsible for this nerve agent attack, and under the terms of a 1991 U.S. law on chemical weapons, you must then implement sanctions. Now, this is the first phase of sanctions. They are relatively limited. They cover engines, electronics, circuits. But if Russia does not comply, for example, by allowing inspections of its chemical weapons sites within the next 30 days, then the second round of sanctions will be implemented this autumn, and those will be sweeping.
Right. Now, interesting thing. So firstly, the Russian state did it, so it appears the Americans are not thinking it could be some renegade officers from the FSB who've done it. But the second thing is, what do we mean by the American state when we say that the sanctions are being imposed? Is this the White House? Because the White House has been hot and cold on this whole thing since March. Or is this the State Department, or who?
Well, to be specific, it's not Donald Trump. 3 weeks ago, as you noted, Donald Trump met Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, chose Vladimir Putin over his own intelligence agencies. It is the agencies, the State Department, the CIA, the Department of Defense, that have driven this review and that have made this conclusion. So once again, we do have a potential battle between a president who is opposed to any sanctions on Russia, although he has reluctantly acceded to them in the past, and his agencies, whom he has criticized recently, saying no, Russia is responsible and there must be firm steps taken. And in addition, it is now Trump versus the U.S. Congress, including Republicans in the Congress, who say sanctions must be taken.
Right. Just a quick one, Scott. Should the British be doing more sanctions? I mean, I know one or two people were tweeting tonight that the Americans are doing it. What are the British doing? Obviously, we have European sanctions against against Russia, but are we now not doing enough?
The the British are on a linked track here. So they can sort of follow this U.S. process, which is mandated, say we support it. So the U.S. has the lead now on the economic front. But meanwhile, the British are now seeking the extradition of 2 Russians who they claim are responsible for this attack. So they will pursue the legal and security front. So you sort of have the two sides, at least at the agency level, not between Donald Trump and Theresa May, right, but at the agency level, they're working together.
Scott Lucas, thanks very much indeed. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.